So today we're going to be talking about some of the really common art mistakes that I used to make when drawing and how I'm slowly starting to learn how to rectify them. Hi, I'm Kiwi Kana, and if you don't know me, I'm a freelance digital artist and illustrator with a degree in sequential art, and my goal is to break down my art process here on YouTube and share all of the tips and tricks that I've learned over the years. So let's get into it. So I drew this piece about 2 years ago, I think at this point, and I remember being really proud of it at the time. Now looking back, I can see some of the big issues and things that I was really struggling with, and I want to do a deep dive into them to maybe help you avoid some of these issues in the future and learn what to do instead. So the first big mistake I made here is in the composition. Interestingly enough, the actual layout of the piece isn't that bad if I sort of divide this up into sections. So following the rule of thirds, you're going to break it into 3x3 sections. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, just like that. And it's really not that bad. Her face is actually pretty close to that major focal point where her eyes are hitting. That said, we do have this massive area of just nothing happening in the background where we're really lacking any visual interest, so that's something I want to address in the redraw. Another really big issue here is with our background, middle ground, and foreground elements. So you can see that we technically have a background, which is creating some depth, although we're definitely missing some interesting elements there. And then we have our character, which is kind of acting as that focal point in the midground, but we're really missing any foreground elements. And that's a really big issue because it's making the image look really flat and lacking in depth, so that's something we're definitely going to want to add in our redraw. Maybe some leaves or branches coming down, or it could just be her hand reaching out closer to the camera, pretty much anything to create that illusion of depth. I'm not sure what it'll be yet, but we'll figure that out when we start sketching. So I'm just going to start by blocking back in that rule of thirds grid, and I'll use that as my guideline for the composition. Once again, I'm going to have her face kind of sit around that intersection of the lines in the top right-hand side of the canvas because that's going to be one of the places that the eye is drawn to. So I'm going to keep that the same, but I am going to change her body position and the angle of her head a little bit because, let's be honest, the original angle was very boring and very flat. We didn't really get to see the dimensionality of her face, so that's one of the things I want to address in this new pose. In an attempt to make my foreground elements, let's say, more apparent, I've decided to give her wings. In the original sketch, you can see that she has these sort of feathers on her neck, and I think I was going for this bird girl sort of character, but I didn't really execute it in a way that made any sense at all, so I'm trying to make those elements more clear and interesting, which is what led me to the wings. Now, I really wanted to get this drawing done quickly. I was on a deadline because I had a really busy week and I did not feel like figuring out these wings, you guys. So instead, I used a 3D model to just plunk down, trace over, and tweak later. I'm gonna flash up the 3D model that I used on the screen, so if you're a Clip Studio Paint user, you can download it and use it yourself. And here's your reminder not to feel guilty about using resources that are available to you. As long as you're being ethical in your usage of them, you're crediting the people when you need to credit them, there is nothing wrong with using these resources. They are literally in the asset store for you to use them, so don't feel bad about that. Okay, rant over, and we'll get back into the drawing now. Now I'm moving on to sketching in the background. In the original drawing, I just plopped down a photo and did some paint over and editing, which isn't always a bad thing. I don't not recommend doing that, but I wasn't doing it very consciously at the time, and it really shows. So this time I'm going to put more effort into how I'm actually using the background space, and I'm thinking of sketching in some waterfalls and some rocky elements so that we can have some visual interest and have different elements we can play with both closer and further away from the camera. Before we sketch in the face, it's time to get to the second biggest issue with this drawing, and I'm sure you all saw this coming. It's anatomy. There are so many things wrong with this initial drawing anatomy-wise, and it's one of those things that really does just take time to improve on, and you will naturally improve as you continue to draw, but I do have some advice for kind of instantly improving your anatomy that I wish I had been doing then, and I definitely do now, so I'm gonna break those down for you. So already when compared to our model for reference, we can see some pretty glaring issues, a big one being this neck. It is just way too long. Now there's nothing wrong with playing with proportions, but I wasn't doing it with any sort of intentionality. I just drew it too long, so I'm gonna fix that. So now I'm just going in and checking my proportions. They're actually not too horrible placement-wise. You can see me lining everything up with this mannequin on the left, and I don't want to make it seem like you have to follow these proportions strictly every single time because there is a lot of variation in facial structure, right? But the key is to do it with intention. So asking myself why I was making her neck longer. Is that proportional with the rest of her body? Was it an intentional design choice? Was it a choice to make her nose so small? Did that function for the character? Was that intentional? And for me at the time, the answer was no. I just didn't know what I was doing. Really quick, I'm just going to trace over my original drawing without making any adjustments so we have something to compare to, and hopefully we'll be able to see the anatomy mistakes. Okay, now that we have that breakdown, let's compare to the actual forms on the mannequin and then try to replicate those forms from that mannequin onto our original drawing. So I can already tell that I did not map this out well because the nose and the mouth are just way too far over to the left. They don't follow the center line at all, so I'm gonna tweak that here. Otherwise, we're not looking too bad. The nose is definitely way too small and the lips are definitely not as far out as they should be. They usually hit around the center of the eye, so I haven't done that. So now we'll compare this new sketch to our original layout and see how we did. There's a big difference, right? So I'm just gonna keep all of this in mind as I'm sketching out my new face. You can see me mapping out my forms and checking my proportions here, and it really does make a big difference. Another thing I want to pay attention to is my values. The values in the original piece aren't too bad. There's enough contrast between light and dark to keep her face the focal point, but it is something that I want to keep in mind as I start to color. I'm just throwing in a gradient map here to get a sense of my color scheme, and then I'll start blocking in my light values and dark values. I love starting out in grayscale and then using gradient maps to move to color later on. If you've been following me for a while, you've probably seen me do this before, and it really just takes the guesswork out of my values. I think it makes my colors a lot better, so I definitely recommend trying this technique out if you ever feel too overwhelmed to jump straight into color. I'm working on painting in this face, and once again I have a model from Magic Poser, which I'm using as a lighting reference. I always like to take a picture of myself as reference because you get all of the nuances of an actual person, but then I also like to use Magic Poser alongside that picture because it helps me really break down the forms and see everything a lot more clearly. I feel like if I'm using an actual person as reference, sometimes there's a little too much going on and I get visually overwhelmed. So I recommend using both a 3D model and an actual photo when working if you can. I've just found that it's really helped me out a lot. I'm also making sure to punch up that saturation around all the areas where the light meets the shadow. That's going to create a much more natural effect in the skin and basically anything you're drawing. It really helps avoid muddiness. I'm gonna work on this background a little bit now. I really struggle with backgrounds still to this day. I've talked about it a little bit before on my channel, and I think a lot of artists struggle with it because we love drawing people. It's something I really like to draw, so I just don't have as much experience painting in backgrounds. One thing I really have to remind myself is that often less is more. I tend to go overboard with details, and you don't really need to do that when the focal point is a face like this. It's more important to use the background to guide the eye back into the face, not to be overly detailed or visually overstimulating. So that's a goal I'm definitely trying to have here. Even though I am trying to give it more thought, I don't want it to be just blurry splotches of color in the background, but I also don't want to distract from the actual focal point of this piece. I decided on these waterfalls because I thought that it would create some interesting movement and flow in the artwork, which will hopefully direct the eye back in between these two wings that are sort of framing her face. Once again, my goal here is to have everything visually working together to keep the eye in the actual artwork. You don't want to have random elements that are directing the eye off the canvas because then people are going to take less time looking at your piece. It's going to feel less cohesive. You can let me know in the comments if you think that I achieved that. I'm still definitely working on my composition skills. It's honestly something that I'm not super confident in, but reminding myself to include all of these elements and be thoughtful about it has definitely made me feel a little better. Another thing you'll see me do a lot in the speed paint is zoom out so that the drawing is really, really tiny. The tinier the better. And I do this so that I pay more attention to the drawing as a whole rather than all of the individual parts. It's really easy to get caught up in rendering, like, okay, I'm rendering the hair and now the wings and now the face and the background, etc. But really those are just very small parts that contribute to the piece as a whole. So I'm trying not to pay too much attention to the individual pieces and instead focus on how they're working together, so zooming out and not getting that caught up in the details helps me keep all of that in mind. I'm moving on to painting the wing now, which I've honestly been putting off until this point. That's not something that I recommend doing, but I can't help myself. If there's a difficult part of a piece, I often leave it towards the end, and then I really regret it when I've lost my stamina and have to tackle something that I do not feel like I can do. Dealing with things that are hard in your artwork is definitely a challenge, because if you start with them, then you might burn out on a piece too quickly and won't be able to finish it. But if you leave them to the very end, there's nothing to look forward to in the process, and then you don't want to finish it. So it's kind of a catch-22. I usually tackle things like that sort of at a midpoint when I've done all of the really exciting stuff at the beginning, but I haven't moved on to all of the finalizing details at the end. I don't know if anyone has some advice for me about this, but if you do, please leave it in the comments. We all have things that we have to improve on as artists, and this is definitely one of mine. Now I'm just adding in a little more detail in the background and sort of cleaning up all of the elements that are still kind of messy. I kept this one under-rendered. I don't know, I was having fun playing with just a solid brush and not doing too much blending or worrying about things looking super smooth or clean. I also made sure to go back in and use a big airbrush over the background with a sort of light cyan color to create this sense of atmospheric perspective, especially because you're going to have all of the water particulates in the air that are kicked up from that waterfall. It's going to create this sort of misty environment, so I want to make sure I'm capturing that as well. I want to thank everyone who's watched this video so much for your support. It really means a lot to me, and I hope the video was at least a little bit helpful and will maybe help you avoid some of the mistakes that I've fallen into as an artist. I really think it's important for artists to share our process, and so if you like seeing my work, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. I post a new video every week, so stay tuned for that, and in the meantime, you can follow me on my Instagram and TikTok, which are here on the screen, to see what I'm up to. I definitely still have a lot of room for improvement, but I feel like I have made a lot of progress over the last 2 years, and I'm proud of that. I can't wait to see the kind of progress that we'll all make in the next 2 years. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next one.